They're in the trees. Get down. The words barely left Obergefreiter Klaus Richter's mouth before the first burst of machine gun fire tore through the darkness. 3 men in his squad dropped instantly, their bodies crumpling into the snow that had become their coffin. The date was February 3rd, 1945, and Klaus's company was stranded 12 kilometers behind what used to be German lines in Pomerania, trying desperately to reach the Oder River. Klaus pressed himself against the frozen earth, his breath coming in ragged clouds. Around him, the remnants of the 214th Infantry Division scrambled for cover that didn't exist. The forest that had seemed like salvation an hour ago had transformed into a killing ground. Soviet partisans and advance units had perfected the art of the ambush, and Klaus's company was learning that lesson in blood. Before we continue, if you're interested in real stories from World War II, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's return to that frozen nightmare in Pomerania. Feldwebel Otto Becker crawled toward Klaus through the snow, his face pale in the moonlight. We've lost contact with the rear guard. The Russians hit them first, blocked the road with a burning supply truck. His voice was steady, but Klaus saw the fear in his eyes. Otto had survived Stalingrad, survived the retreat from Ukraine, but this was different. There was no front line anymore, no clear position to defend. Just scattered groups of German soldiers trying to survive the night. "How many men do we have?" Klaus asked, fumbling with frozen fingers to reload his Karabiner 98K. "Maybe 40. Lieutenant Hoffman is dead. So is Captain Richter. You're the highest-ranking NCO left alive." Otto's words hit harder than the Soviet bullets. Klaus was 23 years old, a baker's son from Freiburg. He'd been in the army for 4 years, and now 40 lives depended on decisions he wasn't trained to make. The machine gun fire had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the moaning of the wounded. Klaus knew what that silence meant. The Soviets were repositioning, preparing for the next phase. They wouldn't rush. They had time, ammunition, and the cover of darkness. The Germans had none of those things. "We can't stay here," Klaus whispered to Otto. "We move north, parallel to the road, but stay in the forest. We try to link up with what's left of the division at Schneidermuhl." Otto nodded. "What about the wounded?" Klaus closed his eyes. It was the question he'd been dreading. 6 men were too badly injured to walk. Leaving them meant death from exposure or capture. Taking them meant slowing down the entire group, making them easier targets. In training, they'd taught him tactics and strategy. They'd never taught him how to choose which men to abandon. "We take anyone who can hold a rifle. Anyone who can't. We leave them morphine and prayers." The words felt like betrayal, but Klaus knew they were the only chance for the others. Over the next 20 minutes, Klaus organized the survivors into 3 groups. The healthiest soldiers formed a perimeter, while the others gathered what supplies they could from the dead and dying. Ammunition was running low. Most men had fewer than 20 rounds. Food was almost gone. But the cold was the real enemy now. The temperature had dropped to at least 20 degrees below zero, and several men were already showing signs of frostbite. Private Hans Zimmermann, a 17-year-old conscript who'd been with the unit for less than 3 weeks, approached Klaus with tears freezing on his cheeks. "Herr Obergefreiter, my brother, he's one of the wounded. He's asking for me." Klaus placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Say your goodbye quickly. We move in 5 minutes." He watched Hans stumble toward his dying brother and felt something inside him harden. The war had taken his innocence in stages, first during the advance in 1941, then during the brutal winter of 1942, and again during the endless retreats of 1944. But this moment, watching a boy say goodbye to his brother in a frozen forest while Soviet soldiers waited to kill them all, this was different. This felt like the death of something beyond flesh and bone. Otto appeared at his elbow. "Scouts report movement to the east. At least a platoon, maybe more. They're trying to flank us." Klaus made his decision. "We move now. Silent march. Weapons ready. Anyone who makes noise gets us all killed." The column formed up in the darkness. 40 men transformed into ghosts moving through the trees. They left behind 6 wounded soldiers, a pile of empty equipment, and the illusion that any of them would see home again. Klaus heard one of the wounded men singing softly, a hymn his mother used to sing. He forced himself not to look back. The first hour of the march passed in tense silence. The forest pressed in around them, every shadow a potential threat. Klaus led from the front, following a compass bearing that would take them northwest toward Schneidermühl. Behind him, the men moved in single file, each following the man ahead, too exhausted and cold to think beyond the next step. At 0200 hours, they reached a frozen stream. The ice looked thick enough to support their weight, but Klaus knew that a wrong step could mean death. He tested it carefully, distributing his weight before waving the first group across. They were halfway when the night exploded again. Muzzle flashes erupted from the opposite bank. Soviet troops had been waiting, knowing the stream was a natural choke point. Klaus threw himself backward as bullets whined overhead. Men screamed and fell, some breaking through the ice into the black water below. The temperature would kill them in minutes. "Back! Fall back!" Klaus shouted, returning fire. His rifle kicked against his shoulder, the flash blinding him momentarily. Beside him, Otto worked his MP-40, spraying the opposite bank with controlled bursts. It was buying them seconds, nothing more. Grenadier Werner Vogel, a veteran from Berlin, grabbed Klaus's arm. "There's a bridge, maybe 2 kilometers upstream. I saw it on the map before we lost the command vehicle." Klaus nodded. "Otto, covering fire. Everyone else, move upstream, stay low." The withdrawal was chaos. Men fired blindly at the Soviet positions, while others dragged the wounded through the snow. Klaus counted 15 men making the retreat. 25 were dead, dying, or scattered in the darkness. The mission to reach Schneidermühl was becoming a desperate bid for survival. They found the bridge 40 minutes later, a narrow wooden structure that looked like it might collapse under a strong wind. But it was their only chance. Klaus sent scouts ahead expecting another ambush, but the position was clear. Either the Soviets hadn't found it yet, or they were waiting for something bigger. As the men crossed, Klaus stood watch with Otto. The Feldwebel was shaking from cold and exhaustion, but his eyes never stopped scanning the tree line. "Do you think any of this matters?" he asked suddenly. "The war is lost. Everyone knows it. We're just dying to delay the inevitable." Klaus considered lying, offering some platitude about duty and honor. Instead, he told the truth. "It matters to the 15 men behind us. If we can get them to friendly lines, get them across the Oder, maybe they survive long enough to go home when this ends." Otto smiled bitterly. "And the home they return to? It'll be in ruins occupied by the same Russians trying to kill us now. My wife and daughter are in Dresden. I haven't heard from them since October." Before Klaus could respond, Private Zimmermann appeared. "Sir, we're all across. Sergeant Weber is asking about demolishing the bridge." Klaus looked at the structure, then at the forest behind them. Destroying it would slow Soviet pursuit, but it would also cut off any other German units trying to escape. Command decisions had once been about tactics and strategy. Now they were about choosing which group of soldiers to abandon. "Leave it," he decided. "Other units might need it. We move fast instead of covering our trail." The march continued into the grey dawn of February 4th. The men were beyond exhaustion, operating on instinct and fear. 2 more soldiers collapsed from hypothermia and couldn't be revived. Klaus ordered them left where they fell, wrapped in their coats. There was no time for burial details, no energy for ceremony. The living had to keep moving. At 0900 hours, they encountered their first refugees, a column of civilians fleeing west from the Soviet advance. Women, children, and elderly men pulled carts loaded with possessions through the snow. Their faces held a haunted quality that Klaus recognized. They'd seen what happened when the Red Army arrived in German villages. The propaganda had filled German heads with stories of Soviet atrocities, some true, many exaggerated, but enough reality to fuel terror. An old woman grabbed Klaus's sleeve. "Please, soldier, have you seen my son? He's with the 342nd Regiment, Wilhelm Schmidt from Stettin." Klaus gently removed her hand. "I'm sorry, grandmother. We've been separated from our regiment. I don't know about the 342nd. She stared at him with empty eyes and released him, shuffling back to her cart. Klaus watched the refugee column pass, hundreds of people fleeing into an uncertain future. Behind them came the Red Army, advancing 25 to 30 miles per day, overwhelming the scattered German defenses with massed armor and artillery. Otto joined him. The refugees say there's a German defensive position at Arnswald, about 15 kilometers west. Mixed units, regular army, Volkssturm, some SS. Klaus felt a flicker of hope. Arnswald meant food, ammunition, medical care. It meant not being alone in the frozen wilderness. Can we make 15 kilometers? Otto looked at the exhausted men. We'll have to. The alternative is freezing to death in these woods. They pushed on, following the refugee column's trail. The landscape was monotonously white, snow-covered fields broken by patches of forest and the occasional burned-out village. Evidence of war was everywhere. Abandoned equipment, frozen corpses, bomb craters. This had been German territory, and now it was being reclaimed by fire and blood. At 1400 hours, they spotted Soviet aircraft overhead, Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovix, hunting for targets. Klaus ordered everyone into the trees where they pressed against the trunks and prayed not to be seen. The aircraft circled twice, then moved on toward what sounded like artillery fire in the distance. The battle for Arnswald had already begun. They reached the town's outskirts as darkness fell. German defensive positions ringed the settlement, hastily dug trenches manned by a mix of regular soldiers and elderly Volkssturm conscripts. A young lieutenant stopped them at the checkpoint, his eyes suspicious. "Papers and unit identification," he demanded. Klaus showed his soldbuch. 214th Infantry Division, or what's left of it. We've been fighting a running battle since our position was overrun 3 days ago. The lieutenant's expression softened slightly. The 214th was listed as destroyed. You're the first survivors we've seen. He gestured toward the town. Report to the command post in the church. They'll assign you positions. We're expecting a major Soviet assault within 48 hours. Klaus led his men into Arnswald, and what he found crushed his earlier hope. The town was a desperate collection of military remnants, shattered units from a dozen different divisions, all thrown together in a last-ditch defense. Supply wagons were nearly empty. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, and the defensive positions looked like they'd collapse under a determined assault. At the command post, a haggard major named Drescher briefed them on the situation. The Soviets have 2 rifle divisions and a tank brigade positioned around the town. They're waiting for artillery support before they attack. When they come, they'll come hard. Your men will reinforce the northern perimeter. It's the weakest section. Respectfully, Herr Major, my men are exhausted. We've had no rest in 4 days, minimal food, and our ammunition is almost gone, Klaus said. Drescher's laugh was bitter. You think anyone here is well rested and supplied? Welcome to the Eastern Front in 1945, Obergefreiter. The Führer says we hold every position to the last man. So we hold. That night, Klaus and his survivors took their positions in the frozen trenches on Arnswald's northern edge. They received 30 rounds of ammunition each, 2 potatoes, and a cup of ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt dirt. It was more than they'd had in days, but it wouldn't be enough when the Soviets came. Otto settled into the trench beside Klaus, cradling his MP-40. You know we're not getting out of here, right? This is a Festung, a fortress town. Hitler's order is to hold at all costs. That means fight to the death. Klaus stared out at the dark forest where Soviet troops were gathering. Then we make our lives cost them dearly. If we're going to die, we die taking as many of them with us as possible. But even as he said it, Klaus wondered what it all meant. The Reich was collapsing. Berlin would fall within months, maybe weeks. These desperate defensive battles were just delaying the inevitable. Yet here they were, digging into frozen ground, preparing to kill and die for a cause that was already lost. Private Zimmermann huddled in the corner of the trench, his brother's identification tags clutched in his fist. He'd been silent since the forest, the light gone from his young eyes. Klaus recognized the look. It was the face of someone who'd stopped believing in survival and was just waiting for the end. "Zimmermann," Klaus called softly, "check your rifle. Make sure it's clean and loaded." The boy looked up with hollow eyes. "Why? What difference does it make?" Klaus moved to sit beside him. "Because your brother would want you to fight. Because the 15 men who made it here depend on each other. Because giving up is easy. And we're not going to make it easy for the bastards who want us dead." Something flickered in Zimmerman's expression. Not hope, exactly, but a ghost of determination. He nodded and began checking his weapon. It was a small victory, but in that frozen trench at the edge of a doomed town, small victories were all they had. The night passed in frigid misery. Men took turns on watch, while others tried to sleep in the trenches, huddling together for warmth. Klaus didn't sleep. He stared at the darkness and thought about Freiburg, about the bakery where he'd worked with his father, about a girl named Anna who'd promised to wait for him. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a different Klaus, from a different life. At 0530 hours, February 5th, the Soviet artillery barrage began. The world transformed into fire and thunder as shells screamed down on Arnswald. The trenches shook with each impact, showering the defenders with frozen dirt and snow. Men pressed themselves against the earth and prayed for survival. Klaus had endured artillery barrages before, but nothing like this. The Soviets had brought up heavy guns, and they were systematically obliterating the German defenses. The barrage lasted 2 hours. When it finally stopped, Klaus's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear Otto shouting, "Here they come, infantry assault!" Klaus forced himself to look over the trench lip. Through the smoke and dust, he saw them, waves of Soviet infantry advancing in classic deep battle doctrine, supported by T-34 tanks. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, moving forward with the confidence of an army that knew it was winning the war. "Hold your fire until they're in range," Klaus shouted. "Make every shot count." The German line erupted with rifle and machine gun fire. Soviet soldiers fell, but more kept coming, stepping over their dead comrades without hesitation. The T-34s rolled forward, their guns turning the German trenches into death traps. Klaus fired his carabiner until the barrel was hot, picked targets, squeezed the trigger, watched men fall. Beside him, Otto's MP-40 chattered in controlled bursts. A Soviet shell hit the trench 20 meters to Klaus's left, obliterating a machine gun position and its crew. The explosion threw body parts into the air, and Klaus tasted blood and cordite. To his right, Private Zimmermann was firing methodically, his face blank, tears streaming down his cheeks. The first assault broke against the German defenses, but Klaus knew it was just the beginning. The Soviets had men and ammunition to spare. They'd attack again and again until the defenders were dead or surrendering. This was the reality of the Eastern Front in 1945. German soldiers fighting with courage and skill, but ultimately drowning in the numerical and material superiority of the Red Army. During the brief lull, Klaus checked his ammunition. 8 rounds left. Around him, the survivors of his squad were in similar condition. They'd held for now, but the next assault would likely be the last. Otto was bandaging a shrapnel wound on his arm, his face grey with pain and exhaustion. "We could surrender," Otto said quietly. "The war is lost anyway. Why die for nothing?" Klaus had thought about surrender many times during the retreat, but he'd heard the stories about what happened to German prisoners, true or not. The fear was real, and there was something else. A stubborn pride that refused to quit even when logic said the fight was hopeless. "We fight," Klaus said. "When the ammunition is gone, we fight with entrenching tools. When those break, we fight with our hands. We came this far. We don't quit now." The second Soviet assault came at noon, preceded by another artillery barrage. This time, the shells fell among the town's buildings, setting fires that merged into an inferno. Klaus watched Arnswald burn and knew the end was near. The northern perimeter collapsed under the weight of Soviet armor and infantry. Klaus's section suddenly found themselves isolated, surrounded on 3 sides. "Fall back to the secondary trench," Klaus ordered, but there was nowhere to fall back to. Soviet infantry was already moving through the destroyed primary positions. Klaus fired his last rounds, then grabbed a fallen soldier's rifle. Beside him, Otto had switched to a captured Soviet PPSH submachine gun, spraying bullets at the advancing enemy. Private Zimmermann took a bullet to the chest and fell backward into the trench. Klaus crawled to him, but the boy was already gone, his brother's identification tags still clutched in his hand. Klaus took the tags, added them to his own, and kept fighting. There was nothing else to do. By mid-afternoon, only 7 men from Klaus's original group remained alive, trapped in a destroyed section of trench with Soviet infantry closing from all sides. Otto had taken another wound, this one to his leg. and could barely stand. The firing had become sporadic, both sides running low on ammunition and energy. A Soviet voice called out in heavily accented German, "Surrender! War is over for you. Come out with hands up." Klaus looked at his surviving men, wounded, exhausted, faces black with powder and smoke. They'd fought well. They'd done their duty. There was no shame in survival. He made his decision. "We surrender," he called back. "We're coming out, don't shoot." Slowly, hands raised, Klaus and his 6 survivors climbed out of the trench. Soviet soldiers surrounded them, weapons ready, but didn't fire. A Soviet officer approached, young like Klaus, wearing the insignia of a lieutenant. He looked at the German survivors with an expression that might have been respect or pity. "War is over for you," the Soviet said in broken German. "You fought good, very brave, now you go to prison camp." Klaus nodded, too exhausted to speak. Around him, Arnswalde burned, the Festung that was supposed to hold at all costs falling after just 2 days of fighting. He thought about the 6 wounded men left in the forest, about Private Zimmermann and his brother, about Otto's family in Dresden, about all the death and suffering that had brought them to this frozen hellscape in Pomerania. As Soviet soldiers led them away, Klaus turned for one last look at the burning town. Somewhere in those flames were the dreams of the Reich, the promises of victory, the illusions that had sustained them through years of war. All of it was burning, and maybe, Klaus thought, that was exactly what it deserved. The column of German prisoners began the long march east, toward camps in the Soviet interior. Many wouldn't survive the journey. Those who did would spend years in captivity before returning to a Germany that no longer existed. But Klaus was alive. Against all odds, through ambushes in frozen forests and desperate defensive battles in doomed towns, he'd survived. It wasn't victory, but in February 1945 on the Eastern Front, survival was the only victory that mattered. The next morning, Klaus and the survivors found themselves in a makeshift prisoner collection point, a burned-out factory on the outskirts of what had been Arnswald. Several hundred German soldiers sat or lay in the ruins, guarded by Soviet troops who looked almost as exhausted as their prisoners. The cold was relentless, seeping through their threadbare uniforms and stolen coats. No food had been distributed since their capture, and water came from melted snow. Otto sat with his back against a crumbling wall, his wounded leg stretched out stiffly. The Soviet medics had done a cursory job of bandaging it, but infection was already setting in. Klaus could see it in the flush of fever on his friend's face, in the way he shivered despite the extra coats piled on him. "Tell me about the bakery again," Otto said, his voice weak. "The one in Freiburg." Klaus settled beside him, grateful for something to focus on besides the misery around them. "My father's place. 3 ovens, always hot. We'd start at 4 in the morning, get the first loaves ready for the early workers. The smell, you can't imagine. Fresh bread, cinnamon rolls on Sundays." He closed his eyes, remembering warmth and purpose. "I was an accountant," Otto said. "Numbers and ledgers. So boring I used to fall asleep at my desk. Now I'd give anything to be bored again. To sit in a quiet office, add columns of figures, go home to my wife and daughter for dinner." His voice cracked. "If they're even alive." Klaus had no answer for that. Dresden had been bombed repeatedly. The chances that Otto's family had survived were slim. But sometimes, hope was all you had, even when logic said it was foolish. A young Soviet soldier, no more than 19, approached with a bucket of thin soup. He ladled it out into whatever containers the prisoners had, dented canteens, helmets, cupped hands. Klaus received his portion in a rusty tin can someone had discarded. The soup was more water than substance, a few potato chunks floating in greasy broth, but it was the first food they'd had in 36 hours. He shared it with Otto, holding the can while his friend drank. Around them, other prisoners were sorting themselves into groups based on unit, rank, or simply shared suffering. Klaus recognized soldiers from at least a dozen different divisions, all the shattered remnants of the German defense in Pomerania. Some were regular Wehrmacht, others Volkssturm, a few SS trying to hide their unit tattoos and insignia. Everyone knew that SS prisoners faced harsher treatment, or worse. Sergeant Erich Weber, one of the survivors from Klaus's unit, made his way over. His arm was in a makeshift sling, and his face bore the purple bruises of a near miss from shrapnel. Obergefreiter, there's talk of escape. Some of the men from the 23rd Panzer Division think they can slip away during the next transport. Klaus shook his head. It's suicide. We're 50 kilometers behind Soviet lines in the middle of winter, with no supplies or weapons. Even if you got away, where would you go? The whole front has collapsed. So we just give up? March east to rot in some camp in Siberia? Weber's voice was bitter, but Klaus heard the hopelessness beneath the anger. We survive, Klaus said firmly. We endure whatever comes, and we survive. The war will end eventually. Maybe in months, maybe in a year, but it will end. And when it does, we go home. He believed it as he said it, though home felt like a distant dream. Weber walked away without responding, but Klaus knew his words had found their mark. Survival was the only realistic goal now. Everything else was fantasy. Around the factory ruins, other prisoners were having similar conversations, weighing the impossible odds of escape against the grim certainty of captivity. Most, like Klaus, chose to wait and hope. 3 days later, the prisoners were formed into a column for the march east. Soviet guards with bayoneted rifles walked alongside, their faces hard and unsympathetic. Klaus helped Otto to his feet, supporting him as they joined the ragged line of German soldiers, beginning what would be a brutal journey into captivity. The column stretched for nearly a kilometer, maybe 1,000 men, all that remained of the German defenders from a dozen towns and defensive positions across Pomerania. They shuffled east along roads clogged with Soviet supply columns moving west. Trucks and tanks rolled past, their crews ignoring the German prisoners except for occasional taunts or worse. On the second day of the march, Otto's fever spiked. He could barely walk, even with Klaus supporting him. By afternoon, he was delirious, muttering about his daughter, about Berlin before the war, about snow and fire and blood. Klaus held him upright, refusing to let him fall, knowing that anyone who couldn't keep up would be shot or left to freeze. That night, in a drafty barn where the prisoners were locked for the night, Otto died. His body simply gave out, the combination of wounds, infection, exposure, and exhaustion claiming one more victim of the Eastern Front. Klaus sat with him until dawn, holding his friend's cold hand, thinking about all the conversations they'd never have, all the tomorrows that had been stolen. When the guards came to rouse the prisoners for another day of marching, Klaus gently closed Otto's eyes and placed his identification tags on his chest. There would be no burial, no ceremony, just a body left in a Polish barn to be dealt with by whoever found it next. Klaus took Otto's personal effects, a faded photograph of his wife and daughter, a pocket watch that had stopped working, a letter he'd never been able to send. The march continued. Days blurred together. Endless walking, minimal food, brutal cold. Men died from disease, exhaustion, and the occasional execution for attempting escape. Klaus kept moving, one foot in front of the other, sustained by nothing more than stubborn refusal to quit. He'd survived the ambushes, survived Arnswald, survived capture. He'd survived this too. After 3 weeks, the column reached a transit camp near Lodz, where prisoners were sorted and registered before being sent deeper into the Soviet interior. Klaus gave his name, rank, and unit to a bored Soviet clerk, who typed the information on a form that would likely be lost or ignored. He was assigned a prisoner number, given a bowl of thin porridge, and locked in a barracks with 200 other men. The camp was a temporary holding facility, not designed for long-term imprisonment. Conditions were primitive, no heat, minimal sanitation, barely enough food to keep the prisoners alive. Men died daily from disease, cold, or simply giving up. Klaus forced himself to keep moving, to maintain some semblance of military discipline. He organized the men in his barracks into work details, shared what meager resources they had, tried to maintain morale in a place designed to crush it. 3 months after his capture, in May 1945, rumors began spreading through the camp. The war was over. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. At first, Klaus didn't believe it. They'd heard so many rumors during captivity, most of them false, designed to demoralize or manipulate. But this time, even the Soviet guards confirmed it. The war in Europe was finished. The prisoners' reaction was complex. Relief that the killing had stopped. fear about what came next, grief for the Germany they'd known which no longer existed. Klaus sat in the barracks that night, Otto's photograph in his hands, and tried to process what it all meant. He'd fought for 4 years, watched friends die, killed men he didn't know, suffered cold and hunger and fear, all for a cause that had led to total defeat. But he was alive. Against all odds, through ambushes in frozen forests and desperate defensive battles and brutal prisoner marches, Klaus Richter had survived. That had to mean something. It had to count for something. As he drifted into exhausted sleep, Klaus made himself a promise. If he ever made it home, he'd tell the stories of the men who hadn't. Otto and his family in Dresden, young Zimmermann and his brother, the 6 wounded men left in the forest, all the anonymous dead scattered across the Eastern Front. Someone had to remember, someone had to bear witness. The years of captivity stretched ahead, 5 more years before Klaus would finally return to Freiburg, to a Germany divided and occupied, to a world that had moved on without him. But that first night after learning the war had ended, Klaus allowed himself a moment of gratitude. He'd survived the cold nights and the merciless ambushes. He'd endured when everything said he should have died. And now, somehow, impossibly, he had a future again. It was more than most of his comrades could say. In the darkness of the barracks, surrounded by sleeping prisoners, Klaus whispered a prayer for all the dead. German and Russian, soldier and civilian, guilty and innocent. The Eastern Front had consumed millions of lives in its frozen hell. The story of 1945 was written in blood and snow, in desperate ambushes and doomed defensive stands, in the grinding destruction of an entire generation. Klaus had lived through it. Now he would have to find a way to live with it,